Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode on my channel, The Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today my guest is Dr. Richard Wilkinson. He is Professor Emeritus of Social Epidemiology at the University of Nottingham, having retired in 2008. He is also Honorary Professor of Epidemiology and Public Health at University College London and Visiting Professor at the University of York. In 2009, he co-founded the Equality Trust. He was also awarded the 2013 Silver Rose Award from Solidar for championing equality and the 2014 Charles Cully Memorial Medal by the Irish Cancer Society. Finally, he is the co-author of the greatly influential book, along with his wife, Dr. Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level: Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better. Dr. Wilkinson, thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I think all it shows is how old I am.
No, I think it shows how great your work is. That would be my opinion. Okay, so to start off with, and today we're going to focus the conversation on your book, as I said, The Spirit Level. And the first question I would like to pose to you is, what is to be considered the situation of economic inequality? Because I think it's very important for people to understand from the very beginning what we mean by inequality.
Yes, the measure we used in our research is the size of the income gap between rich and poor. There are lots of different measures of that gap, but they all mean roughly the same thing. It's talking about the income differences between us in a society, and the data is prepared by the World Bank and organizations like that. The UN Human Development Report uses them, and that's what we use.
Mm-hmm. And
Ideally, we'd use differences in wealth as well, but the data isn't as easily available and it's not so comparable internationally.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so when you talk about inequality, are you referring to the fact that there are differences between people in a given country, or even between countries or around the world, or that these differences are pronounced beyond a certain point?
We're talking about the differences mainly within a society, within a country, sometimes in smaller units, but mostly, for instance, between American states and between rich countries, where there is really good data, not only on income differences, but on health and social outcomes. And it's that data we've used. We would have analyzed, and a few people have, data from poorer countries, and it seems to show the same pattern. Outcomes are less good in more unequal countries, but you can get many fewer outcomes. You can look at usually at death rates or life expectancy in poorer countries, and sometimes at measures of violence as measured by homicide rates. But you can't get measures of mental illness and things like that that are comparable internationally for poorer countries. So our work has been on richer countries.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Okay, and so what would you say is the most important to obtain in terms of equality or even inequality? Because what I want to mean by this is that, would you say that it would be important simply to try to reduce within countries and between countries inequality to a point where we could obtain those social benefits, and I will ask you later about that, what are those social benefits, to a point where they were manageable, let's say, and where it wouldn't lead to social incohesion or societal problems and things like that? Or do you think that equality would be important to try to achieve at an absolute level, that is, everyone exactly at the same level? And I'm asking you this because I think it is important for people to understand, because many times when we talk about equality, and particularly when certain political pundits refer to equality, they tend to mischaracterize it as being something like what was proposed by, for example, people like communists, that would say that the only thing that would be fair is if people were all at the same level, let's say.
It's a complicated question, and mostly how I answer it is simply to say that we do empirical research using the data for different developed countries, and it looks as if the advantages of greater equality go at least as far as the most equal of the developed countries, which are mainly the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden and Denmark. But I think people sometimes suggest that maybe inequality is harmful as long as we regard some people as inferior and others as superior, judging people by their incomes. You know, while there is a hierarchy of personal worth, while we judge each other's internal personal worth from their external wealth, then maybe there is too much inequality. But I really don't know what happens to a society if we get more equal than the Scandinavian countries, for instance. We have no indication that things are less good if you become more equal, nor do we have indications that things go on getting better.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what are the kinds of parameters that you evaluate and include in the analysis of equality in a given country or otherwise? I mean, what kinds of resources do you evaluate that people have access to, that you deem to be important in this analysis?
We're not looking at how people spend their money or what they have. We're just looking at the correlation between different levels of income distribution or different amounts of inequality in those terms, in monetary terms, and how it relates to life expectancy or levels of violence, or teenage pregnancies, or measures of mental health, or measures of child well-being. And why our work attracted attention is we show so many of these different problems are worse in countries with bigger income differences between rich and poor.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so you say in your book that as societies get more equal, they tend to be healthier, people are more trusting of one another, the societies are less violent. Could you tell us about some of the most interesting findings that you got in societies that are more equal?
Well, really, almost all the problems that have what we call a social gradient, all the problems that we know are more common in poorer areas, like less good educational outcomes for children, higher levels of violence, worse health, all those kinds of problems with those social gradients getting worse lower down the social ladder, become more common in more unequal societies. The surprise is that they don't just become more common amongst the poor. The biggest effects are amongst the poor, but even well-off people with good jobs and incomes and education do a bit less well if they live in a more unequal society.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And are there any good explanations for why and how this happens. For example, what happens at the societal, political, and other relevant levels when people differ less in terms of economic status?
We have just written another book called The Inner Level, which really goes into the psychological effects of inequality, which we think are crucial. It's been clear for a long time that social cohesion deteriorates, it gets worse in more unequal societies. Levels of trust, how much people feel they can trust others, go down. Measures of the strength of community life show that that too weakens in more unequal societies. And we think one of the powerful effects is that inequality increases the importance of status and class. It makes us judge each other more by status and class. And its divisive effects come through that. The most obvious and most important is that we all feel more judged and we judge each other more by status. And so those insecurities about self-worth increase. All the sort of anxieties about how others see and judge you, whether they think you're clever or stupid or attractive or unattractive or all those sorts of things. You can see that there are two different responses to feeling more judged as people do in more unequal societies. One is that the levels of status anxiety increase. In all income groups, people seem to feel more status anxiety. And that feeds into, on the one hand, people withdrawing from social life. You know, if I start to find social contact stressful, I start thinking I have to worry about my appearance and my social performance. I start feeling that I don't want to go to parties or meet other people in the evening, and so people withdraw from social life. That often is accompanied by depression and feelings of inferiority. But there's an opposite response, which seems even more common, is that you try and sell yourself, give an impression of your success and so on. So people get, instead of being modest about their achievements and ability, they start being narcissistic, talking themselves up, managing to say that, you know, they had went to such a good university and they got promoted when they were very young, and or other ways of indicating success. You know, it might be the kind of holidays you can afford, stories about that. But one of the most obvious effects is consumerism. The way we try and improve how others see and judge us is by having the right clothes, the right car, living in the right part of town, the right phone, and so on. So consumerism seems to be intensified by greater inequality in society, simply because it's about status competition.
Right. And apart from those issues you referred to, would you say that it might also happen that if the gap between the rich and the poor is too wide, it might happen that people at the lower ends of the socioeconomic ladder, let's say, could also be deprived of access to certain fundamental goods?
Well, and we've had in Britain, as a result of the growth of inequality and the growth of relative poverty, many people now use what are called food banks, where if they're referred by their doctor or other agencies, they can get some free food. and large numbers of people are now using those, but still it's a tiny proportion of the population. And from the point of view of people like myself in public health and epidemiology, we're usually thinking about the majority of the population. And I think that there the material effects are less important than the psychosocial effects, being seen as inferior, feeling looked down on, the shame and so on that goes with that. But I think even at the bottom of society, the same feelings can be at least as important. I mean, homeless people often have an enormous sense of shame and failure and anxiety, and we know how those kind of stresses affect physiological health, impacting on the immune system and on mental health and the cardiovascular system. Long-term stress is very damaging, and it's felt particularly by the least well-off.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in more unequal and unstable societies, let's say, would you also say that they could put even the people at the upper end of the ladder under more stress because perhaps they could feel more insecure due to the fact that the society itself is more unstable?
Well, I mentioned status anxiety earlier, and there is a study of levels of status anxiety in about 35 or 40 different countries, and they measure it in all income groups, from the poorest tenth of the population to the richest tenth. And you see that, I'm trying to do it the right way around for you, the levels of status anxiety are highest amongst the poor and go down amongst richer people. But if you're in a more unequal society, the status anxiety levels are higher amongst the whole population, whether they're rich or poor. They still have that slope showing that they're higher amongst the poor than the rich, but everyone is feeling more status anxiety in those more unequal societies, including the top 10%. But when you talk about the rich, often people mean the top 1% or even less, the super rich. And we just don't have data on that group alone. They're such a small group. So although we know they suffer ill health and sometimes violence and mental illness and so on, we don't have data for them. So I can't say very much about them. I'm sure they are affected, but we don't have the data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now the next question is not particularly focused on your work, but it is related to it, and I don't know if you can comment on it or not, but I will put it forward and then you will tell me what you can about it. That is, last year, Dr. Martin Daly, who is an evolutionary psychologist, you might know him or not, he wrote a book called Killing the Competition. And I'm talking about this because his book is focused on the effects that economic inequality have, particularly on young men that live in impoverished areas of a given country, and he focused on the United States in that particular case. And he referred to the fact that young men that don't have good resources available to them, particularly economic ones, and don't have good prospects of obtaining them, that they tend to express more violent behavior, because that would be a more direct strategy to try to obtain, in that case, women's attention, and so to try to obtain access to sexual resources, let's say. Would you have something to comment on that? Because I already asked you if you think that the fact that people don't have access to certain resources could also aggravate their psychological well-being. Do you think that that could also be helpful to include in the picture of how unstable a society can get due to income inequality?
Well, I think that these things have a long evolutionary background in our evolutionary psychology. And if you think of an animal dominance hierarchy, monkeys, for instance, that are ranked exactly, then the ones at the bottom get very few reproductive, very little sexual access. The low status males, very little access to females. The dominant males try and monopolize access. But also the position in the dominance hierarchy affects access to food and every other resource. And so we are very sensitive to low social status. And now there are international studies which look at the experience of poverty in different societies. Both rich and poor countries. So, you know, they interviewed poor people in India and Pakistan, where poverty probably means living in a little shack with an earth floor, no water supply and so on. But they also interview poor people in Norway, who probably live in a 3-bedroomed house with flat screen television and central heating. And despite the material conditions being so different between the poor in India and the poor in Norway, the experience of poverty is almost exactly the same. It's the psychological effect of feeling a failure, feeling looked down on, the anxiety levels, the sense of shame, and not only feeling shamed by people outside in general, but also humiliated within your own family, not respected by your partner or children. You failed. And you've been talking a lot about asking me questions about resources. That is no longer the key issue. It's not a matter of whether we have the food to stay alive. The question is whether we have the respect of other people, the esteem and so on, or feel humiliated and judged negatively. And that's why I emphasize the psychosocial effects. So it's a sensitivity to social position which underlies the devastating effects of inequality in society, because it makes not only the poor more worried about status, it makes everyone more worried. So think of it in terms of relativities and social status, not a matter of whether you've got a bigger house or whatever. That matters only in where it places you in relation to other people in your society. It's a symbol of your success or failure relative to others.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And would you say that perhaps another issue that we could get as inequality increases is that if more and more resources get accumulated in the hands of people that are higher in the ladder, let's say, for example, the rich 1% or even less than that, that one thing that those people could do is to put those resources working in their favor, in the sense that they try to translate them into more political power and make perhaps politics tilt more and more in their favor.
Yes, I think there's no doubt at all that the rich in many countries have used their wealth to gain more influence and control over the political system. There's actually been studies showing that process, looking at the opinions of different income groups on political issues, and more it's the opinions of people at the top, the richest people, that prevails in these in the most unequal countries. And it looks as if it also leads to a political polarization. Political opinions become more divergent. And there's several studies in the United States that show that there was a time when Democrats and Republicans used to overlap in their voting, but now they vote entirely separately. And that seems to be correlated with the growth of inequality. I may say, when you mentioned Martin Daly's work on homicide, on violence, there are now so many studies showing that violence is more common in more unequal societies, and it's because status becomes more important. And, if I feel disrespected by you, and I have no other access, no other way of showing status, maybe through education or jobs, if I have none of that, then there's one way I can make you respect me. And again, people show that the trigger, the most common trigger to violence, is people feeling humiliated and loss of face, disrespected. It's that matters, and it's that links it to inequality.
Right. Okay. And we have now at a worldwide level, let's say, we have data that tell us that over time, particularly over the last few decades, we've been observing an increasing middle class in terms of number of people that reach it, particularly in Asian countries. But on the other hand, as we've been talking about here, in Western countries, it seems that inequality has been growing over time. So, do you think that there's any way in which we could say that we have a net negative or a net positive at the worldwide level because of these two seemingly disparaging facts?
There are studies, lots of studies, and it's easy to show that economic growth matters amongst poorer countries, but doesn't matter in the richer countries. So, for instance, if you look at GNP per capita in relation to happiness or life expectancy, you get a curve like this. It rises rapidly as poorer countries get richer, and then it levels off. And so if richer countries get richer still, it doesn't lead to an increase in their life expectancy or levels of happiness. In a sense, it seems to me what that data is telling us is that economic growth, which has transformed the quality of our lives, that it's just about finished its important work. And I think that raises the question of how do we now improve the quality of life in our rich societies? And I think much the most important issue is the quality of social relations, social cohesion, involvement in community life, levels of trust between us. And it's that where inequality makes such a powerful difference. Let me give you a little indication of how important inequality is to those kinds of outcomes. There are, as I've said, studies which show that the more equal countries, community life is stronger. 60 or 70% of the population feel they can trust others. In the more unequal countries, it drops to 15 or 20% feeling they can trust others, and many, many fewer people being involved in community life. There are also studies which show that we're less willing to help each other in more unequal societies. And you get the rises in violence that you mentioned, that people like Martin Daly have studied, but many others as well. And so what's happening is you're losing the egalitarian ethos with a good deal of reciprocity, mutuality, people helping each other and so on, and more and more social isolation, mistrust, violence. But then if you look at really unequal countries, much more unequal than the ones we studied, if you go to places like Mexico or South Africa, you find that with their appalling levels of inequality, houses have bars on their windows and on their doors, and there is razor wire along the fences around their gardens, and they sometimes have notices saying that if you try and climb in, you might get shot. So you moved from those egalitarian societies with a good deal of reciprocity to societies where people are frightened of each other. And that exactly that same picture of the effects of inequality is given in quite different data. People have looked at the proportion of the labour force involved in what is called guard labour, the amount of people involved in security staff and police and prison officers and so on. The more inequality, the more that proportion of the labour force goes up. And those are the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. So they're another sign that we're becoming fearful of each other. And that transformation, that appalling transformation in the quality of social relationships, it's worse even than I've outlined, because the studies of happiness, of well-being, of life satisfaction show that the quality of our relationships with each other is absolutely crucial. And it's there that inequality does its damage.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Okay, so earlier in this conversation, at a certain point, you referred to the Scandinavian countries as being the ones where we find more equality nowadays, of course. And I would like to pick on that example because there are people who use it to say that, or to try to make the argument that that happened specifically in those countries because they were more homogeneous in terms of ethnicity and perhaps even in other social parameters, let's say. And that was the fact that then promoted trust among people and allowed for the society to promote social policy that then reduces inequality, let's say. What would you respond to that argument? Do you think that it is possible that we might have here a chicken and egg problem? That is, that it would be possible that the societies that are able to reach lesser inequality levels are the ones where people already trust themselves the most?
Well, I think we should remember the extent to which in those, when we had them, those more homogeneous societies, often lower classes were regarded as if they were a different race. They were actually seen as genetically inferior, the lower classes genetically inferior. So that looks quite like the sort of racial prejudice. The class prejudice and racial prejudices aren't very different. And indeed, when skin color or your religious affiliation or the language group you belong to within a society, when that becomes a marker of low social status, it attracts all the same kinds of discrimination. So I think that homogeneity maybe makes these issues a bit easier, but Basically, what happens is inequality exacerbates the issues to do with integration and so on. It makes all that more difficult. I may say that in one of Martin Daly's study of violence in relation to inequality, people in the United States, in his study, the one I'm talking about, was of the American states and the Canadian provinces, showing the different levels of violence in relation to inequality. And people said, well, maybe it's not inequality behind it, maybe it's the violence amongst the poor black population in each state. And to deal with that criticism, he looked at just homicides committed by white people in the United States and Canada, and looked at inequality just amongst the white populations. And the relationship between inequality and violence just amongst whites was almost unchanged from what he'd shown, including the black population.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so what would you say, or what are the solutions that you would put on the table as being the best evidence-based solutions to try to reduce economic inequality, or at least to mitigate its pernicious effects?
Well, I don't go into great detail in social policy because it's a highly difficult technical subject to, for instance, know which social security benefits redistribute income and how you can raise taxes more from the rich, because, of course, people always have ways of escaping tax. But what we do see is that basically, there are two ways of reducing inequality. One is through the welfare state, high taxation, and redistribution of incomes. So you start off with perhaps big differences in earnings and you reduce them through taxes and benefits. But the other way is to start off with smaller differences in earnings to start with. And it looks to us as if it doesn't make much difference which way you do it. You get the social benefits and the health benefits both ways. I think we would be silly not to use both ways of doing it. I think the weakness of relying on social expenditure and high taxation is that it's so easy for a new government to undo it. So you might win at last a little bit more redistribution, and then the next government that comes in doesn't like it, and so it undoes it all. It's so easy to undo. I do think that we need to deal with tax havens and tax avoidance. Of course we have to do that. It's really very damaging. But even more important, I think, is we should be pursuing all forms of economic democracy, by which I mean not only token representation of employee representatives not only token numbers of employee representations on company board, but a growing representation over time. I think we also need more incentives and assistance to cooperatives and employee-owned companies. And it looks as if more democratic companies not only have much smaller income differences, and you might think your boss should have twice as much as you or even 5 times as much as you, but in these big multinationals, many of them are getting 300 times as much as other people in their company. None of us would accept those sort of differentials as fair. But the other benefit of those kinds of more democratic companies is they actually seem to improve productivity. There are now quite a number of studies suggesting that you get, if you combine participative management with ownership, you get reliable increases in productivity. I also think it makes a difference to the quality of the experience of work. So I think there are many different benefits of moving towards greater economic democracy. Indeed, I think of it as what should be our long-term aim, and perhaps the next step in human emancipation, if you like. So instead of, as the communists tried to do, increase inequality by reducing democracy with the costs of limiting freedom of speech and the police state and all that kind of thing, we have to do it by extending democracy from the political sphere into the economic sphere.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have any formed opinion on this or not, but would you say that perhaps a proposal like universal basic income could also help tackling these issues?
Yes, I support the universal basic income, though I think it depends on how it's funded, who pays for it, things like that. But I think it's particularly important in relation to the future and the effects of automation. You know, there are now studies that suggest that anything from a third to half the labour force's jobs are vulnerable to automation. Estimates suggest that it's unlikely that new jobs will ever be created fast enough. And to deal with that, I think that, you know, that's an enormous threat in terms of inequality. You could end up with a small labour force, very highly paid, very overworked perhaps, and massive unemployment. But much better is that we should share the remaining work and have some form of universal basic income so we can live with very little work. And the suggestions are that would perhaps lead to a development and an increase in the sharing economy, the free economy, all the ways in which people provide free services to each other on the internet, whether it's computer programs or Wikipedia or rock groups putting their music up for free, all those kinds of things which might really take off in future circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Wilson, before we finish this conversation, Wilkinson, yeah, before we finish this conversation, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can find your work on the internet?
On the internet, most of it, quite a lot of our papers, academic papers, so not the easiest things to read, are available. I don't know whether people use Google Scholar, but it gives you free access. And if you look for Wilkinson and Pickett, my co-author, you'll find academic papers. We also started the Equality Trust, which has quite a bit of information on the background things. Its address is www.equalitytrust.org.uk. But the easiest access is through our books, which one of them is translated into Portuguese. The Spirit Level is now in Portuguese. Again, just search for, and its title is different, but if you search for Wilkinson and Pickett, you'll find it. And our new book, I think not yet available in Portuguese, called The Inner Level. But again, our two names as the co-authors will give access.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will search for it and leave all the links in the description box to this video. So, okay, so Dr. Wilkinson, thank you again a lot for taking the time to have this conversation. I think it was very interesting and informative.
Okay, well, I hope it was easily understandable. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and consider making a pledge if you like the work that I've been doing. And I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Elga Larsen, Lau Guerrero and Chantel Gelinas. Thank you for all.